Hello, this is Max. In the future, two space travelers are aboard a spaceship, and they also have the ability to journey to Earth in the bodies of their identical clone counterparts in order to be with their families. Don't forget to subscribe. In 1969, David is engaged in drawing portraits of his children when his wife Jessica interrupts, reminding them of their plans. The family enjoys a pleasant time at the theater, where they encounter a couple who recognizes David from the news, marveling at how lifelike he appears. However, Jessica cuts the conversation short, and they return home, where she notices a suspicious van nearby but chooses to ignore it. Later, after putting the children to bed, David and Jessica spend time in a romantic setting before David's wristwatch alerts him that he must leave. Meanwhile, Cliff leads a quiet life in the countryside with his wife Lana and their son Henry. They moved away from crowds, but Henry is distant and cold toward Cliff. Their life is uneventful, with Cliff performing chores and minimal interaction with Lana. Lana appears bored and possibly depressed. While dealing with dishes, Cliff's wristwatch also beeps, signaling his return to work. Both Cliff and David rush to a secret room in their respective houses, where they activate special chairs and enter passwords, transporting their consciousness to a space station. They are partway through a 6-year deep space mission and maintain robot replicas of themselves on Earth to spend time with their families. They only awaken in the station for tasks and maintenance. On this day, they've been called back due to a warning, and Cliff prepares to don his spacesuit for repairs, disconnecting from his Earth replica. Thankfully, the issue isn't too serious, and with David providing guidance for the communication system, Cliff completes the task in just a few minutes. Afterward, the two men engage in some casual conversation before returning to their regular lives on Earth. Cliff then heads back to Lana, who is in bed reading. She expresses a desire to host a party for their new neighbors and get better acquainted with the locals. However, Cliff is somewhat hesitant and promises to consider the idea, although Lana senses he will likely decline. Meanwhile, David is abruptly awakened by noises emanating from downstairs. He cautiously grabs a bat and proceeds cautiously to the living room, where he is taken aback to find a group of extremist activists. The leader, Kappa, condemns David as an abomination and claims that their group is on a divine mission. They are determined to see the machine and disregard David's pleas for them to leave. No! Despite David's attempts to resist, he finds himself powerless as the group closes in on him, forcefully pinning him against the counter. In a shocking and gruesome turn of events, Kappa robs David of his arm. However, to everyone's astonishment, there is no bleeding, leaving Kappa to marvel at the bizarre and unnatural nature of David's condition. Following this, Kappa reaches for a hammer with the intention of striking David's head, but in an instant, David abruptly regains consciousness within the space station. In a state of panic, David hastily resets the machine and reconnects to his robot replica, only to discover that he is now tied up on a couch. The extremist gang has captured his family, and Jessica shows them her bloodied hand as proof of their humanity. However, Kappa remains unswayed, convinced that David's family are sinners for associating with what he sees as an abomination. David is now forced to witness the horrifying spectacle as these deranged individuals proceed to murder his family, leaving their blood splattered on the walls and then setting a fire to incinerate both the bodies and the replica itself. Meanwhile, at Cliff's house, he receives a late-night call about David's tragic situation. He returns to the spaceship, where he finds his devastated friend. However, David, overwhelmed by grief, rejects Cliff's attempts to comfort him and angrily shouts at Cliff to leave him alone.
I said get out of here!
Cliff reconnects with Earth and shares the heart-wrenching news with Lana, though she has already seen the story in the morning newspaper. Cliff reached out to ground control and received instructions to leave David alone, as he had learned that the criminals had surrendered to the police. Although Cliff was offered security guards for his house, he declined, knowing that they wouldn't be able to locate the secluded location. He had concerns about David's isolation and boredom on the station, and Lana wondered why they couldn't create a new replica. Apparently, it was impossible without the original body to replicate, and even if they could, David had nothing to return to. As Cliff continued to return to the station, he grew increasingly worried. While David was talking less, there were no other noticeable unusual signs. One morning, Cliff read in the newspaper that David's family would have a televised funeral, realizing that David would have access to it. In the station, David watched the funeral alone, deepening his depression. Days passed, and the isolation, coupled with the lack of activity, began to affect David, causing him to slowly lose his grip on reality. One afternoon, while fishing with his son, Cliff received an emergency report about an airlock issue on the station. Upon arrival, he found David locked in a room, seemingly in a trance-like state, as if he were attempting to jeopardize the mission or end his own life. Cliff forced the door open and checked on David, who claimed to be okay.
Everything okay? Sure.
Upon returning to Earth, Cliff confided his concerns in Lana. If David were to do something to sabotage the mission, Cliff would face the consequences, potentially even death. Lana suggested that Cliff allow David to use his link for just an hour to take a break from the isolation and enjoy some fresh air, but without letting their son Henry in on the situation. Later, Cliff returned to the station and, during the routine checks, offered David the chance to use his link. David eagerly accepted the offer, and before going, Cliff informed Lana to be kind to him. Once on Earth, David had to adjust to his new body. Lana gave him a warm welcome and took him for a walk in the forest, sharing her favorite spot by a massive tree. David absorbed the sights and sounds, marveling at the various insects, the fresh air, and the sensation of leaves. Overwhelmed, he even shed tears, and Lana comforted him with a hug. After their return, David took a long look at the house while Henry watched from inside. Upon his return to the ship, David expressed his gratitude to Cliff for the experience. With renewed inspiration, he began sketching again. Several days later, when Cliff returned to the station, David showed him a drawing of the house, impressing Cliff with its accuracy, considering David was working from memory. David suggested that if the family purchased some oils, he could create a complete painting as a thank you gift. Of course, he understood if Cliff didn't want to share the link again for that purpose. Cliff promised to consider it and returned home to discuss the details with Lana, assuring her that it would only be an hour once a week. Initially hesitant, Lana was eventually persuaded by Cliff's argument that painting could be therapeutic for David. So, she agreed to the arrangement. The next time David woke up on Earth, Lana had set up a complete art studio and a record player in the barn. David noticed she had a sci-fi book, sparking a conversation about the genre before Lana left him to work. For the first time in a while, Lana felt like she had a genuine conversation. Days passed with the two astronauts sharing the link as they had agreed. Painting was clearly having a positive effect on David. Initially, Lana gave him space, but over time, they grew closer, and she started spending time in the barn while he painted. One day, David brought Lana closer to teach her how to make a stroke on the painting, and Lana felt a warmth at the fact that her husband's body was being affectionate with her again. When David was alone on the station, he began spending his time drawing portraits of Lana.
Do you have any linseed oil? I've run out.
Eventually, he convinced Lana to drive to the hardware store to buy oil for the paintings. While Lana shopped, David left the car and relished being in town again. When Lana returned, he persuaded her to visit a bookstore where he bought his favorite sci-fi book for her. However, an awkward moment arose when the cashier recognized him, prompting David to pretend to be Cliff. The conversation became uncomfortable when she mentioned David's tragedy, and Lana had to cut it short. Back in the car, Lana comforted David by placing her hand on his shoulder, and he reciprocated by covering it with his own. Later in the evening, David returned to the station with newfound inspiration, while Lana couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of his touch. During his next visit, David finally completed the painting by including a portrait of Lana on the canvas, which he found flattering. Then, in a celebratory moment, David asked Lana to dance with him, but in the middle of the dance, his hands began to get more intimate. Lana pushes David away and rushes into the house, unaware that Henry is watching. David follows Lana and suggests that he can tell she wants him based on how she looks at him. Lana firmly rebukes him, reminding him that she sees her husband, not a visitor.
But this is not your home and you are not my husband.
Heartbroken, David returns to the barn and discovers that the painting has been ruined with Henry there, having gotten paint on his hand. In a fit of anger, David hits the boy, who runs into the house. When Lana learns of the incident, she tells David to leave. When David wakes up on the station, he keeps the incident to himself. Cliff returns to Earth and has an argument with Lana, who is upset that a stranger hit Henry. Cliff doesn't fully grasp the problem, as he has done it too. He believes that David needs closure and convinces Lana to let him come one last time to finish the painting.
Okay.
During his next visit, Lana leaves with Henry, leaving David to work alone. In the station, Cliff discovers that the treadmill is not working, forcing him to find something else to occupy his time. While looking through David's drawings, he stumbles upon ones of Lana without clothes. David receives an alert on his watch and returns to the station, but it's only Cliff who demands an explanation for the drawings. David tries to explain that they are just fantasies, but Cliff hits him anyway. In response, David tells Cliff that he has everything but doesn't care, leaving Cliff contemplating his actions. Back on Earth, Lana waits in the car with Henry until she knows Cliff will be back. Cliff connects to his replica and destroys the painting in the barn before having an argument with Lana. Lana denies having done anything with David but admits to having some warm reactions to boredom and loneliness. Realizing he hasn't been taking good care of his wife, Cliff apologizes and hugs her. The next time Cliff returns to the station, David apologizes and requests one last visit to Earth to apologize to Lana as well. Furious, Cliff turns him down and lies, claiming that Lana finds David disgusting and deceitful.
You will not see or speak to her ever again.
Sometime later, Cliff is on Earth, attempting to be a better husband and father. He suddenly receives an alert on his watch and rushes back to the station, where David informs him that something broke outside. Cliff leaves his personal effects behind, dons a suit, and goes to inspect the station panels. However, he finds nothing broken there, and David remains unresponsive through the comms. Cliff tries to return but discovers that the door is locked. He begins yelling, and after several minutes, he is finally allowed back inside. David explains that he was in the bathroom and that the computer sent a false report.
Where's my tag?
Cliff finds this suspicious and notices that his tag is missing. Suddenly, David produces the tag from his pocket, causing Cliff to panic. He grabs the tag and rushes back to Earth, only to wake up to find his replica covered in blood. Terrified, Cliff investigates, following a trail of bloodstains until he discovers the bodies of his family, leading to a complete breakdown. Moments later, a distraught Cliff returns to the spaceship, where a chilling David offers him a seat. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen, and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.